Why manipulators target kind people. Manipulators don't choose their victims randomly. That sentence alone reveals a truth most people refuse to confront because it challenges a comforting belief, the belief that being a good person automatically protects you from harm. Many kind people grow up believing that honesty, patience, empathy, and generosity will attract the same qualities in others. They assume the social world works like a moral mirror, where kindness reflects kindness and sincerity attracts sincerity. But manipulators do not operate inside that moral framework. They operate inside a psychological one. And psychologically speaking, kindness can become one of the easiest traits to exploit. When a manipulator encounters someone who is empathetic, patient, and eager to maintain harmony, they do not see vulnerability in the traditional sense. They see opportunity, not because kindness is weakness, but because kindness often comes with predictable behavioral patterns that can be tested, stretched, and eventually controlled. To understand why manipulators target kind people, you first have to understand how manipulators think. Most people assume manipulation is chaotic or impulsive, but in reality it is usually systematic. Manipulators observe before they act. They study reactions. They notice who apologizes first, who explains themselves too much, who hesitates to say no, and who feels responsible for other people's emotions. These signals are like psychological green lights. They reveal that the person values harmony more than confrontation, understanding more than judgment, and compassion more than boundaries. For a manipulator, this is not a moral situation. It is a strategic one. One of the most powerful tools manipulators rely on is empathy exploitation. Empathy is the ability to feel and understand another person's emotional state. In healthy relationships, empathy strengthens trust and connection. But in manipulative dynamics, empathy becomes a lever that can be pulled again and again. The manipulator creates situations that trigger the empathetic person's urge to help, forgive, or understand. They may present themselves as misunderstood, wounded, stressed, or unfairly treated. The kind person, driven by empathy, begins to shift their focus away from evaluating the manipulator's behavior and toward understanding the manipulator's pain. This is the critical psychological pivot. Instead of asking, "Is this person treating me well?" the empathetic person begins asking, "What must this person be going through to act this way?" That shift alone can sustain manipulation for months or even years. Because once empathy becomes the lens through which everything is interpreted, harmful behavior begins to look like something that needs compassion instead of correction. The manipulator senses this immediately. They notice that when they provide a sad explanation, the other person softens. They notice that when they express regret, the other person forgives quickly. They notice that when they act distant or upset, the other person rushes to fix the emotional atmosphere. Each of these reactions confirms something extremely important to the manipulator. This person will prioritize my emotional comfort over their own boundaries. And once that pattern is discovered, it rarely stays subtle. Another psychological factor that makes kind people attractive targets is the people pleaser dynamic. People pleasing is not simply about being nice. It is a behavioral strategy developed to maintain approval and avoid rejection. Many people learn this pattern early in life, especially in environments where love or acceptance felt conditional. They learn that being agreeable, helpful, and emotionally accommodating reduce conflict and increase safety. Over time, this pattern becomes automatic. Saying yes feels easier than saying no. Explaining feels easier than asserting. Apologizing feels easier than disagreeing. Manipulators instinctively test for these patterns. Often the first tests are extremely small. They might ask for a minor favor that slightly inconveniences the other person. They might arrive late and watch the reaction. They might make a slightly unfair request and see whether the other person pushes back or immediately adapts. These moments are not random. They are diagnostic. If the kind person hesitates but ultimately complies, the manipulator receives valuable information. They learn that resistance exists, but it dissolves under pressure. That is exactly the type of personality that can be gradually conditioned. Conditioning and manipulation works through incremental escalation. The manipulator rarely starts with major violations. Instead, they stretch the boundary a little at a time. A small favor becomes a bigger one. A late reply becomes emotional distance. A dismissive comment becomes criticism disguised as honesty. Each step is small enough that the kind person rationalizes it. They tell themselves things like, maybe they're just stressed, or it's not a big deal, or I don't want to overreact. What they do not realize is that every unchallenged boundary becomes the new baseline. The manipulator quietly updates the rules of the relationship. Over time, the kind person begins to feel something strange and difficult to explain. They feel responsible for maintaining the emotional stability of the relationship. If the manipulator becomes cold, the kind person wonders what they did wrong. If the manipulator withdraws, the kind person tries harder to reconnect. If the manipulator criticizes them, the kind person analyzes themselves instead of questioning the criticism. This psychological inversion is one of the clearest signs that manipulation is happening. The person who is being mistreated becomes the person doing the emotional labor. But the deeper reason manipulators target kind people lies in something even more subtle: predictability. Kind people tend to behave consistently with their values. They want to be fair, understanding, patient, and compassionate. Those values guide their decisions even during conflict. While this is admirable, it also makes their reactions easier to predict. A manipulator knows that if they apologize convincingly, the kind person will likely forgive. If they share a painful story, the kind person will likely empathize. If they frame their behavior as a misunderstanding, the kind person will likely reconsider their judgment. Predictability creates control, because once someone can predict your emotional reactions, they can start shaping them. For example, imagine a manipulator who notices that you become uncomfortable when someone is upset with you. The moment they sense resistance, they may shift the emotional tone of the interaction. Instead of arguing logically, they become hurt or disappointed. Suddenly, the conversation is no longer about their behavior. It is about your effect on their feelings. The empathetic person, uncomfortable with causing emotional pain, backs down. From the outside, this looks like compromise, but psychologically, it is reinforcement. The manipulator learns that emotional pressure dissolves resistance faster than rational discussion. Another reason manipulators prefer kind targets is that kind people tend to self-reflect deeply. When conflict happens, they ask themselves what they could have done differently. This is usually a healthy trait, because self-reflection allows people to grow and improve. But manipulators exploit this tendency by planting seeds of doubt. They may subtly question the kind person's interpretation of events. They might say things like, "You're being too sensitive," or "That's not what I meant," or "You always misunderstand me." These statements may seem small, but they create cognitive friction. The kind person begins analyzing the situation from multiple angles. They replay conversations in their head. They try to be fair. They try to see both sides. Meanwhile, the manipulator benefits from the confusion, because the more mental energy the kind person spends questioning themselves, the less energy they spend evaluating the manipulator's behavior objectively. Over time, this creates a psychological fog where clarity disappears. The kind person remembers how caring the manipulator seemed in the beginning. They remember moments of warmth and connection. They want to believe those moments represent the manipulator's real self, while the harmful behavior is temporary or circumstantial. This belief keeps them invested even when the relationship becomes exhausting. What makes this dynamic especially powerful is that kindness often comes with moral commitment. Kind people do not abandon others easily. They believe relationships should be worked on, repaired, and understood. Manipulators take advantage of this perseverance. When conflict arises, the kind person tries harder to communicate, compromise, and improve the situation. The manipulator, however, interprets this effort differently. They see proof that the other person will stay even when the relationship becomes unbalanced. And once that belief forms, the manipulator's behavior often becomes more careless, more demanding, and more entitled. The tragic irony is that the very qualities that make kind people valuable friends, partners, and colleagues are the same qualities manipulators rely on to maintain influence. Empathy encourages understanding. Patience delays confrontation. Self-reflection encourages doubt. Commitment prevents withdrawal. Each trait on its own is healthy, but when combined in the presence of a manipulator, they create a psychological environment where exploitation can quietly grow. None of this means kindness is the problem. The real issue is the absence of boundaries that protect kindness from being weaponized against the person who possesses it. Manipulators understand something many people do not. Kindness without boundaries becomes a renewable resource they can extract from indefinitely. And that is why manipulators rarely target people randomly. They look for emotional generosity, tolerance for discomfort, and a strong desire to maintain harmony, because those traits allow them to test, stretch, and eventually control the psychological space of the relationship without immediate resistance. The moment you understand this dynamic, a disturbing realization emerges. Many people who believe they were simply unlucky in relationships were not chosen by chance. They were chosen because their kindness made them visible to people who knew exactly how to exploit it. And the first step to breaking that pattern is recognizing that manipulation does not begin with cruelty. It begins with observation. Manipulators watch carefully, waiting for the moment when empathy overrides self-protection. And when that moment appears, they know they have found the type of person they were looking for. Continues the deeper psychological mechanics of why manipulators specifically pursue kind and empathetic individuals, because once the manipulator confirms that a person has empathy, patience, and a tendency to maintain harmony, the next phase begins: boundary testing. Boundary testing is one of the most subtle and systematic processes in manipulative dynamics. Most people imagine manipulation as dramatic or aggressive, but in reality it often unfolds through tiny behavioral experiments. The manipulator does not immediately attempt control. Instead, they test the edges of what you will tolerate. They observe what happens when they slightly inconvenience you, slightly disrespect you, slightly pressure you, or slightly shift responsibility toward you. Each of these moments functions like a probe, and the response they receive determines how far they can go next. The reason this strategy works particularly well on kind people is because kind people tend to interpret small violations generously. When someone interrupts them repeatedly, they assume the person is excited or distracted. When someone forgets commitments, they assume the person is busy. When someone says something slightly hurtful, they assume it was unintentional. This habit of charitable interpretation is a reflection of empathy and emotional maturity. But manipulators understand something important about human perception. Patterns are invisible when each event is explained away individually. If a manipulator behaves poorly once, it looks like a mistake. If they behave poorly twice, it looks like stress. If they behave poorly 10 times but always offer an explanation, it still may not look like a pattern to someone who is actively searching for reasons to understand them. This is where boundary testing becomes powerful. The manipulator slowly collects evidence that you will tolerate behavior that others might question immediately. For example, imagine a manipulator who frequently asks for favors but rarely reciprocates. At first, the requests are small and easy to fulfill. The kind person helps without hesitation because helping feels natural. Over time, the requests become larger. They require more time, more emotional energy, more compromise. But because the relationship already contains a history of helping, it becomes psychologically difficult for the kind person to suddenly refuse. Refusing now feels inconsistent with the identity they have already expressed, and manipulators understand the power of identity consistency. When someone sees themselves as generous, supportive, or understanding, they feel internal pressure to act in ways that maintain that self-image. The manipulator subtly encourages this pressure by framing their requests in ways that appeal to the person's identity. They might say things like, "You're the only person who understands me," or "I knew I could count on you," or "You're such a good friend." These statements seem like compliments, but they also function as psychological anchors. They reinforce the idea that the kind person's role in the relationship is to be supportive, reliable, and emotionally available. Once that role is established, any attempt to step outside it begins to feel uncomfortable. The person may worry that saying no will make them appear selfish or uncaring. The manipulator benefits enormously from this internal conflict because it means the pressure to comply does not have to come from them directly. It comes from the kind person's own desire to remain consistent with their values. Another key element of boundary testing involves emotional reactions. Manipulators carefully study how someone responds to discomfort. If they criticize you lightly and you laugh it off, they learn that criticism is tolerated. If they ignore a message and you immediately double text to check if something is wrong, they learn that silence creates anxiety in you. If they act distant and you rush to repair the emotional atmosphere, they learn that emotional withdrawal gives them control. These reactions may seem insignificant, but they provide manipulators with a behavioral map. Over time, they begin using specific behaviors deliberately because they know exactly how you will respond. For instance, if they learn that you become anxious when communication stops, they may start using the silent treatment strategically. Silence becomes a tool, not an accident. The moment you resist something they want, they withdraw emotionally. The empathetic person interprets the silence as conflict or disappointment and tries to fix it. They reach out, apologize, or compromise. The manipulator then returns to normal, reinforcing the belief that restoring harmony required your effort. What makes this pattern so difficult to recognize is that the manipulator rarely frames their behavior as manipulation. Instead, they present it as emotional authenticity. They might say they needed space, that they felt hurt, or that they were overwhelmed. Each explanation sounds reasonable on its own, but the pattern reveals something different. Emotional responses are being used to regulate your behavior. The reason kind people struggle to identify this dynamic is because they focus heavily on intentions rather than patterns. They want to believe that people's actions reflect temporary feelings rather than strategic decisions. Manipulators take advantage of this interpretive habit by always providing explanations that trigger empathy. The more empathetic the person is, the easier it becomes to redirect their attention away from the manipulator's behavior and toward the manipulator's emotional story. Another layer of boundary testing involves subtle guilt manipulation. Guilt is one of the most effective emotional levers because it motivates people to repair perceived harm. Manipulators introduce guilt gradually. They may express disappointment when you cannot meet a request, even if the request was unreasonable. They may compare your behavior to others in ways that imply you're less supportive than expected. They may remind you of things they have done for you, even if those things were voluntary. None of these actions are aggressive enough to provoke a clear confrontation, but they create a quiet emotional pressure. The kind person begins to feel that maintaining the relationship requires additional effort. They may start doing more than they originally intended simply to avoid the uncomfortable feeling of letting someone down. This dynamic becomes especially powerful when the manipulator mixes appreciation with disappointment. For example, they might praise your kindness while simultaneously implying that you could have done more. This creates a psychological loop where the kind person continuously tries to live up to the positive identity being described. They want to prove they are as supportive as the manipulator says they are. What they do not realize is that the standard is constantly shifting. No matter how much effort they give, the manipulator always leaves room for more. Over time, the relationship begins to feel strangely imbalanced, but the imbalance is difficult to articulate. The kind person may feel exhausted yet unable to explain exactly why. Another reason manipulators favor kind targets is because kind people often hesitate to enforce consequences. Boundaries without consequences are simply requests. Manipulators quickly learn the difference between someone who states boundaries and someone who protects them. A kind person might say they value honesty or respect, but if those expectations are violated and the relationship continues unchanged, the manipulator understands that the boundary is flexible. They interpret the lack of consequences as permission. This is why manipulators often escalate behavior gradually rather than immediately. Each step confirms that resistance will fade if enough emotional pressure is applied. Eventually, the manipulator may reach a point where their behavior becomes noticeably unfair or dismissive. At this stage, the kind person might finally raise concerns. But by now, the manipulator has already built several psychological advantages. They know the person dislikes confrontation. They know the person values understanding. They know the person fears damaging the relationship. Because of this knowledge, they respond strategically. They might minimize the concern, suggesting the issue is being exaggerated. They might redirect the conversation toward the kind person's tone or delivery. They might frame themselves as misunderstood or unfairly criticized. These responses do not resolve the problem, but they shift the emotional focus of the conversation. Instead of discussing the manipulator's behavior, the conversation becomes about the kind person's reaction. Once again, the empathetic individual begins analyzing themselves. They may wonder if they communicated too harshly or misinterpreted the situation. This internal self-questioning is exactly what the manipulator wants. The longer the kind person stays focused on their own reaction, the less attention is placed on the original issue. One of the most unsettling aspects of manipulation is how invisible it can feel while it is happening. From the outside, the relationship may appear normal. Friends may see moments of warmth and assume everything is healthy. Even the kind person themselves may struggle to identify the exact moment when the dynamic shifted. That is because manipulation rarely begins with obvious control. It begins with small permissions. Each time a boundary is tested and tolerated, a new layer of influence forms. Each time empathy overrides self-protection, the manipulator's strategy becomes more effective. Over time, the kind person may begin to feel as though they are constantly adjusting themselves to maintain the relationship. They monitor their words carefully. They avoid topics that trigger tension. They prioritize the manipulator's mood. Without realizing it, they have moved into a psychological position where the relationship revolves around managing the manipulator's reactions. The manipulator rarely has to ask for this level of accommodation directly. It emerges gradually from the pattern of boundary testing and emotional conditioning. What makes this particularly painful for kind individuals is the realization that their best qualities were used against them. Their empathy became a channel for emotional pressure. Their patience delayed necessary confrontation. Their willingness to understand allowed harmful patterns to continue longer than they should have. Yet the truth is not that kindness caused the manipulation. The truth is that manipulators deliberately search for environments where kindness exists without strong protective limits. Because in those environments they can stretch the boundaries quietly, one small step at a time, until the relationship becomes structured around their needs rather than mutual respect. And by the time the kind person begins to see the pattern clearly, the manipulator has already spent a long time learning exactly which emotional buttons to press. It begins with the realization that many people only reach after months or even years inside a manipulative dynamic. The manipulation was never about you being weak, naive, or unintelligent. It was about you having psychological traits that manipulators know how to exploit. The moment this becomes clear, something important shifts. Because the final stage of understanding why manipulators target kind people is recognizing the deeper mechanism that keeps the cycle alive, emotional investment combined with moral identity. By the time manipulation becomes visible, the kind person has already invested a significant amount of emotional energy into the relationship. They have listened, helped, forgiven, explained, and tried to repair problems many times. This investment creates a powerful psychological force known as commitment escalation. When people invest heavily in something, they become more motivated to justify continuing rather than accepting that the investment was misplaced. In manipulative relationships, this often appears as the belief that the situation can still improve if enough effort is applied. The kind person remembers the early moments of connection. They remember the times when the manipulator seemed understanding, charming, or vulnerable. They hold onto those memories as proof that the relationship has potential. The manipulator relies on this memory because one of the most effective techniques in long-term manipulation is intermittent reinforcement. Intermittent reinforcement means that positive experiences appear unpredictably among negative ones. The manipulator may behave coldly or dismissively for days, then suddenly become warm, attentive, and affectionate. This sudden shift creates emotional relief. The kind person feels hopeful again. They interpret the positive moment as evidence that the relationship is returning to what it once was. What they do not realize is that unpredictability actually strengthens attachment. Psychologically, rewards that arrive inconsistently create stronger behavioral conditioning than rewards that appear consistently. The brain becomes focused on anticipating the next positive moment. In other words, the kindness and warmth that appear occasionally do not repair the relationship. They reset the emotional tolerance for the next cycle of mistreatment. For manipulators, this cycle is extremely useful. It allows them to maintain influence without providing stable respect or care. The relationship becomes emotionally confusing, but not completely hopeless. And as long as hope exists, the kind person continues investing effort. Another factor that keeps kind people in manipulative dynamics is the fear of becoming someone they are not. When someone values empathy and compassion, the idea of withdrawing support from another person can feel morally uncomfortable. The kind person may worry that setting strict boundaries makes them selfish, cold, or unforgiving. Manipulators subtly encourage this fear. They might suggest that the kind person has changed, become distant, or lost their compassion. These statements trigger the kind person's moral identity. They do not want to be seen as uncaring, so they soften their boundaries again. This is one of the most powerful psychological traps in manipulation. The manipulator reframes self-protection as moral failure. Once this framing is accepted, every attempt to protect oneself feels like a betrayal of one's own values. The kind person begins to believe that enduring the situation patiently is the ethical choice. But the truth is that empathy without boundaries is not compassion. It is self-neglect, and manipulators depend on people confusing those two things. There is also a deeper cognitive process involved in why kind individuals struggle to disengage from manipulators. Kind people often possess strong reflective thinking. They analyze situations carefully and try to understand multiple perspectives. While this is usually a strength, manipulators exploit it by creating ambiguous situations where the truth becomes difficult to isolate. For example, when confronted about hurtful behavior, a manipulator might partially apologize while also introducing doubt about the interpretation of events. They might say they are sorry you felt hurt, but insist that their intention was misunderstood. They might claim they were reacting to something you did earlier. The conversation becomes layered with explanations, justifications, and emotional reactions. The kind person, wanting to be fair, attempts to process all these elements simultaneously. They consider the manipulator's intentions, emotional state, and perspective. Meanwhile, the manipulator benefits from the complexity, because the more complicated the explanation becomes, the harder it is to reach a clear conclusion about responsibility. This cognitive fog allows the pattern to continue. Over time, the kind person may feel increasingly exhausted but still unable to confidently label the situation as manipulation. One of the final psychological advantages manipulators have over kind people is that kind people often believe in potential more than patterns. They believe people can grow, change, and become better. This belief is not wrong. People can change, but manipulators rely on the assumption that belief in potential will delay accountability for present behavior. The kind person keeps waiting for the manipulator to become the version of themselves that appeared in the beginning. They think the caring, attentive version was the authentic one, and the harmful behavior is temporary. But manipulation reverses that assumption. In many cases, the early charm was the strategy, and the later behavior reveals the stable pattern. Recognizing this is painful because it forces a reinterpretation of the entire relationship. Moments that once felt meaningful begin to look like calculated influence. Compliments begin to sound like positioning. Apologies begin to look like resets rather than genuine change. This realization can feel emotionally disorienting, but it is also the beginning of clarity. Because once the pattern becomes visible, the manipulator's power begins to weaken. The most important lesson in understanding why manipulators target kind people is not that kindness should disappear. It is that kindness must be protected by awareness and boundaries. Healthy kindness includes the ability to say no without guilt. It includes the ability to observe patterns instead of accepting endless explanations. It includes the willingness to prioritize self-respect even when someone else is disappointed. Manipulators search for individuals who have compassion but lack these protective structures. When those structures appear, manipulators often lose interest quickly. This is because manipulation requires emotional leverage. Without access to guilt, obligation, or excessive empathy, the manipulator's strategies become ineffective. They cannot rely on silence to control you if silence no longer triggers anxiety. They cannot rely on guilt if guilt no longer overrides your judgment. They cannot rely on confusion if you begin focusing on patterns rather than stories. In fact, one of the clear signs that someone was manipulating you appears when you start setting firm boundaries. Instead of respecting them calmly, the manipulator reacts with frustration, disappointment, or accusations. They may claim you have become selfish or difficult, but this reaction reveals something important. The relationship was functioning according to rules that benefited them, and boundaries disrupt those rules. For kind people, this moment often feels uncomfortable at first because they are not used to causing friction. But friction is sometimes the signal that a healthy boundary has finally appeared. A relationship that collapses when respect is required was never stable to begin with. Ultimately, the reason manipulators target kind people is simple but unsettling. Kind people offer emotional resources that manipulators want: patience, understanding, forgiveness, and support. When these resources exist without strong limits, they become easy to harvest repeatedly. But once kindness is paired with self-awareness, the entire dynamic changes. The manipulator can no longer rely on predictable empathy or automatic forgiveness. They encounter resistance, clarity, and consequences. And manipulators rarely stay in environments where those things exist. The deeper message behind this entire dynamic is not that the world punishes kindness. The message is that kindness must evolve. Mature kindness is not passive. It does not absorb endless harm in the name of compassion. Mature kindness recognizes that protecting your psychological space is not cruelty. It is responsibility. When you understand this, you stop asking why manipulators chose you and start recognizing something far more important. They did not choose you because you were weak. They chose you because you had something valuable. And the moment you learn to protect that value instead of giving it away freely, you become someone manipulators can no longer control.